Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
The first question I have for you, and you feel free to answer, raise your hand, smile, indicate in some fashion, okay? The phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, okay? Who knows where it's found? All right, I see Bert raising his hand. Kabul raised her hand. Anybody else? Okay. Kathy raised her hand. Anybody else? Okay. All right, so let's see. Bert, just tell us what you think. Where do you think it is?
It's in Kiddushim.
It's what?
I forget the exact. It's in the Parshat Kiddushim, in the Holiness Code.
Kiddushim.
I forget the exact. It's 19 something or other.
Okay. All right. Leviticus 19 is what you're saying. Leviticus chapter 9. Okay. Good. All right. Now, Tybal, what do you say?
Same as Bert, but I was going to say Holiness Code Vayikra 19.
Okay.
And I think it's other places, but I think Holiness Code is the most important.
All right.
Because of the context.
All right. Does anybody else have another? Where do we find love your neighbor where's the original source of love your neighbor as yourself? All right. So I've had two answers. Anybody else?
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. Okay. Anybody else? Nobody's biting. All right. Now, let me just explain by telling you at the outset, I have asked that question before a Jewish groups of varying sizes, okay? And frequently, the answer that I get is the Christian Bible. Okay? Well, it's in there, although it's in a slightly modified form. But yes, so the answer is what we've heard right now is absolutely correct. It's Leviticus 19:18, and the way it's actually 19:18b, because there's 3 segments to that verse. Anyway, the way I remember that is, what year was World War I over? 1918. That's when people began to love each other again. Ha, 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 ha. Oh, yeah, am I so far from the truth? Anyway, all right. So yes, Leviticus 19:18, Parshat Kedoshim, that's exactly where it is. And we're going to look at that a little bit later on in the context there, because it's more significant than just saying what I just said. But of course, I asked the question because we're talking about love, right? And that's a very basic Jewish statement that deals with love, and there it is. All right, now, I want to begin with another relevant source that is actually alluded to at the beginning of chapter 1 in the book. But I want to give you the whole source now, just to kick it off with a little Torah, okay? And then we will move on. Then we're going to have you guys doing a lot of talking, so I can, number 1, save my voice. And so number 2, we can hear you, because this is a participatory process. This is more like a book group than a lecture series, okay? Because we're all reading the book, so to speak, for the first time, all right? I mean, I'm reading way ahead, but still, this is not a book I owned 6 months ago. So, all right. So here's what it said. This is from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 3, Mishnah 14. And these are the words of Rabbi Akiva. He used to say, "Beloved is the human, for the human was created in the image of God. Especially beloved is the human, for the human was made, because it was made known to the human that he was created in the image of God." Okay, so there's 2 levels, right? Beloved, chiba, what it says is really chiba chaviv adam. Chaviv adam. The human is beloved. And then it says afterwards, that says chiba yetera, additional love was made known to him. So the first thing is that he was created, that the human being was created in the image of God.
It's not a law that's important. This is not waste money. This is
Bob Meth.
And this is simply not a law that...
Yes. Bob, mute.
It's for...
Mute, Bob. Thank you. All right. So, again, the human being, it was an expression of love by God, that the human being was created in God's image. But it's an additional statement, expression of love, that God actually told him so. Because knowing from God that you were created in God's image is a sign of God's love. So it begins with that universal statement, but then it becomes more particular, right? Then it says that Israel, the Jewish people, are beloved by God because they are called children of God, children to Hamakom, the place, which is another word for God. Okay, where is that done? Okay, well, that's something that is a fact, right? We are called the children of God. But it's additional statement of love in that we know that we have been called the children of God, because it says in Deuteronomy 14, Banim atem l'Adonai Elohechem. You are the children of Adonai Elohechem. Okay, so we have a statement. So again, two levels, a basic level of love and then an extreme level of love. All right. And by the way, so if somebody asks you, since Judaism, Christianity is part of the background to the book, okay? So if somebody says to you, well, don't you know that Jesus was the Son of God? Then you can say, well, I'm a child of God too, because it says in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 14, we are all Israel are children of God. So that's fine. Jesus was a Jew, so he too was a child of God, just like I am. Try that sometime. All right. Anyway, and then the final thing, and now it's getting more specific. All right. Israel is deemed beloved in God's eyes because he gave him a very precious gift, a very precious vessel, right? A kli chemda, all right? A vessel, a thing, like a precious, imagine a precious silver cup or something. What is it? But we'll find out in a minute what it was. All right. But it's an additional expression of love that they were told that he gave them this special vessel, because it says, Ki lakachov natati lachem, I have given you a good gift, a good thing. What is it? Torati al ta'azovu, do not abandon my Torah. The Torah was a gift from God, and we know it was a gift from God, and that's a sign of love too. So I'm saying this because you can see this is already in the Mishnah, the Mishnah compiled around 220 CE, Common Era, that you see already this concept of God being a God of love is present. This is another example. Okay, and of course, as we move our way through the book, we will see that Rabbi Held is expressed. It will turn to many different sources, ancient, medieval, modern, and to amplify this, and he will use this whole concept of love. And this is what we're going to get into, what you should have studied and read in the introduction, that this whole concept of love expresses itself in different ways with all kinds of subtleties. And what will become interesting is he will then focus on different subtleties and develop the expressions of love that are there. Okay. But again, you understand, he says from the get-go that he has Christianity in mind because very often, historically, it is true that Christians, starting, I don't know, maybe in certain ways with Paul already, that we, the Jews, are people who believe in a God of law, whereas the Christian God is the God of love. Okay? And that really came in various forms to shape the tension that existed ideologically between Jews and Christians. And it's been passed down through millennia. Okay? And that's really what was bothering him so much, that he was felt compelled to write the book. And he says at the outset, he hopes that he can reach into Christian audiences and they will read this as well. And the point that he makes is, and by the way, I think if you will see in the style, there's a lot of repetition.
Yeah.
A lot of repetition. And he will cite different sources on the same point, or even, some statements of his own. And I think the reason for that is because he assumes that people reading the book will not really have been exposed to this part of our tradition that he says is foundational. Foundational. He wants to have us think that this is the foundational concept. Okay, and although at one point he will say, well, it's love and law, right? It's faith and action, whereas Christianity may have fallen over here to the less physical, less material elements, whereas Judaism finds spirituality within the material world. And by the way, if you think about it, the famous statement that's found in the Talmud, you're supposed to say 100 blessings a day, right? 100 blessings a day. Can you do that? Of course you can do it. If you daven 3 times a day with the Amida, that's 57 right there, because there's 19. Say Bil Paramazon, whenever you eat bread, there's 8 blessings or 4 blessings right there each time, et cetera, and so forth. But what's included in that, okay? When you see a beautiful tree, beauties of nature, a very brilliant scholar who's not a rabbi, right? A king, all kinds of things that are expressions of the material world, you say, thank God, because one way or another, these are expressions of God's presence, i.e., and he would say, and I would say, God's love. All these blessings are an expression of love of God. So we find the Spirit of God, and we find God's love embedded within the world in which we live. It's not just an amorphous concept. It's actually something that you can almost feel. And the other point that he makes, and with this I'm going to stop and listen to you, the other point that he's really wanting to say is that love by us is not simply a concept. It has to impel us to act in a loving way. If God loves us, then we are supposed to love God's creatures, because we are called upon what Bert said earlier, Parshat Kedoshim. Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. You be holy because I am the Lord your God am holy. Sanctify life because I am sacred and I am part of life. And I do that. We have to imitate God. We have to love in imitation of God. And that means that the love has to be translated into how we act. And this is another basic point that he makes in what we have read, and that will pop up continuously throughout the book. Okay, that's my introduction. Now, I have 4 questions. It's Pesach time. Welcome to my Seder. I have 4 questions that I will ask. First, I'll tell you what the 4 of them are, and you can do anything you want to them. All right. Number 1, what did you find meaningful? What did you find most interesting? You may have found something very meaningful, but this really was very interesting because how it was presented were some new ideas that caused your mind to get excited. What did you find troubling? Okay. And was the reading clear or confusing? Because it is complex, but I just want to find out how you manage with all these things. Okay. So let's start. What did you find meaningful? Bobby Meth has his hand up.
But I don't know if I should answer because I haven't had an opportunity to read. I was responding to something you just said and what you just concluded with, which was almost identical to what Justice Alito got in trouble for last week by saying that, by being quoted saying that it would be a better world if there was more godliness.
Yes, well, right, but I think the problem
That's all he said. That's all he said.
Yeah, there should be more godliness. The question is he going to superimpose the Bible on top of the Constitution?
He didn't imply any of that.
Huh?
When he was interviewed deceptively.
I read it. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, all he said, she said he agreed that the world would be better if there was more godliness.
Yes. Yeah,
that was the quote. But that's all I was responding to. I thought it was very similar.
Yeah, fine. Okay, well, good. But I mean that I think any religious person should say that. By the way, any religious person.
But B'Tselem Elokim is in Christianity and Judaism, and not in Islam.
Right.
The concept.
Right. But the Christians use that in obviously a much more materialized way, interestingly, than we did. Right. I mean,
in part, yes. In that part, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but I'm sure they wouldn't disagree that that we should act
That
like
all,
God. Right.
and that all human beings deserve dignity.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's the point.
Not only those who accept a particular image of God as God.
Yeah, and there
are no infidels.
The point, well, I mean, the point is there are people who, yes, and Held says the same thing. He says, I may disagree, I'm using this in my words, but basically it's what he's saying. I am a person of faith. There are people in this world who are not people of faith, but they act as if they were people of faith because they love people. They love other humans. They care for other creatures. And I have to, you would say, I have to love them for the fact that they love that way because that's part of the big picture. And fine, and I have rabbi friends, theologians who say the same thing. Okay. And I resonate with that too. I mean, there are people in this world who are not people of faith, but who can serve as a role model in terms of how they act for other people who claim to be people of faith, but sometimes don't act like they're people of faith. And I have to recognize. Okay, thank you, Bobby. Denise Berger.
Bert Klein and racist.
Oh, Bert had his hand up first. Okay, thank you.
Oh, I would cede. I would cede to the gentle lady.
Okay,
for the moment.
All right, Denise.
The one thing that stood out when you were quoting Rabbi Akiva and how it says that you're beloved to Hashem, and then that extra level where Hashem tells us that we're beloved in the image and all that. And I think, I don't know, it kind of resonated to me because anytime you tell somebody something about their value, it's kind of raising them up and it gives them like extra energy to aspire to something more, and it kind of builds their esteem. And I think it sort of popped into my head because it's the workplace that I'm in. And there are some people who I feel are very loving and they're very like encouraging and always tell you when you're doing great. And there's some people who don't do that and they withhold it intentionally. And it feels very much the opposite of being loving.
Yeah. No, that's sad that happens. I understand. Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I hate to say it, but look, I know rabbis who have acted that way. I mean, who can become, it was sad. I'm not going to mention any names, obviously, but I remember when I was in rabbinical school, so we were working, a friend of mine and I were working at a synagogue where the senior rabbi was a well-known person. He was quite a scholar, actually. And I remember one day he sat with us and he was yelling and screaming at us about certain other rabbinic personalities of renown. And he just was raking them over the coals. And we were sitting there. We were not rabbis yet. We were rabbinical students being yelled at, not because of us, but because of this other guy's disagreement with them. And it was horrible. And it was a rabbi, and I knew that I was not going to, it gave me an example of the role model of the rabbi that I should not be. Sometimes, it's like I always say that the matriarchs and patriarchs were the founding fathers and mothers of our people, but sometimes they were not necessarily
role models,
family members, favoring a child over the other. I don't think so. Anyway. But so this rabbi definitely was a role model I didn't want to follow. Yes, but thank you. No, it's absolutely a good point. Absolutely a good point. And I think that's one of the points that he makes, that indeed that's the case, because knowledge that, he deals in what we have read for today. He deals with the whole notion that knowledge of your self-worth is very important as long as it doesn't remain simply as an egotistical element. But it should impel you, therefore, to realize that you have a capacity to do good things in them. And only if that is recognized and encouraged can you do that. And that's, I think, what you're saying, Denise. And it's absolutely correct, I think. Yeah. Bert.
I'll try and comment on 1 and 2, but I can't wait to comment on 3 and 4. So let me start with one of the most interesting things to me had to do with the whole Christianity comparison. And I am forever conscious of the fact that we Jewish Americans, hyphenated people, assimilated to some extent, have absorbed a lot of the Christian outlook. and we don't even realize it. We do it in language, and when I talk later about the word love, that's a very loaded word, because religiously, love comes to us a lot through Christian ideas. So I thought that his emphasis on the fact that many Jews do not look at Judaism as a religion of love, and look only at the strictness of it and the law, and don't see the balance. From what I understand, I think you were talking about this, Rabbi Rembaum, there's a balance in Judaism between law and compassion. And you can't have only compassion, and you can't have only love. So that's part of what I got as a positive thing, and I found it interesting, but I'm waiting for 3 and 4 because I had some problems.
Yeah, okay, good. That's fine. Yes. No, I think that's absolutely correct. And I mean, I'll just give you one example of, it's not exactly that, but the stilted notion of what Judaism is about, based on ignorance, in a very much assimilated person. Now, I remember that before I became rabbi of the synagogue, I was a professor at University of Judaism, but I would do these high holiday things, sometimes in the same synagogue, a few times, or in various places, and I would meet very interesting people. So I was doing one of my high holiday gigs, as we call them in the business, and this young man was talking, and he says, "Boy, that's all of Judaism is all about guilt, guilt, guilt. That's all it is, because that's all I hear when I go to synagogue." And I asked him, "When do you go to synagogue?" "Well, I go to synagogue every year on the high holidays." And I said to him, "Of course you're going to think it's guilt, because it's on the high holidays that we address our guilt. Okay, but behind it, if you look closely, is the whole concept. We can do that because we think that God ultimately is a compassionate God. It says so. Read the book. Do you ever read the book?" "No, I can't. I don't read Hebrew." "Well, what about the English translation?" I wasn't yelling at him. Don't worry. I wasn't yelling at him. Okay. But the whole point is, so for him, that was Judaism. And I said, "Have you ever been to a Simchat Torah celebration? Have you ever sat around the table and sung Zmirot on Shabbat?" Et cetera, et cetera. He didn't know what I was talking about. So in a sense, the assimilation goes along with ignorance. And yeah, and you're right. I mean, that has crept in. But again, I want to remind you as a historian, Jewish exposure to the majority culture has affected Jews and their perspective of Judaism throughout the generation. It's not a new thing, right? I mean, this is an area that crosses into Jewish religious expressions, to be sure. But I want to remind you that Maimonides, Rembaum, was one of the great Aristotelian thinkers of the Middle Ages, right? That's Aristotle. As far as I know, he did not convert to Judaism, right? And it was a biggie, yeah? And he actually wove Aristotelian ideas deeply into his theology regarding God and his whole approach to Judaism. Now, he used it he believed as a reinforcement. But I can tell you, for every rabbi in the medieval period who accepted his teachings, there were probably 2 or 3 who would be willing to burn his books because they thought it was too assimilated. He bit off too much. He pushed too hard because from their perspective, it weakened things. And to a certain degree, Kabbalah developed as a pushback against Maimonidean thinking, because that was much more mystical. It didn't deal with logical, right? Logic was not the foundation of Kabbalah. It was spiritual interaction with the presence of God, which it's warmer, even though it became highly systematized, when read the Zohar. But at the same time, it was a pushback. So all I'm saying is what you're talking about, that Jews have absorbed a Christian view of the world to some degree. Yes, but unfortunately or fortunately, we've been doing that for about 3,000 years or so, I think. Okay. Who's next? Marion.
Hi, Rabbi. I have heard something, and I would love you to comment on this. Basically, that when Christianity was formed, it pulled the love piece out I'm simplifying it, pulled the love piece out. So it became Christian, the love piece. And in order to distinguish ourselves from Christianity, Judaism sort of swung the other way more because it had to find a way to separate itself from Christianity. And that is just something that I've heard. And I just wondered if you'd. So then it's taken us till now to realize, some of us, not to realize that Judaism is part of, love is part of Judaism. And it was just taken away, in a sense, by the Christians. And therefore we couldn't emphasize that because then we look too much like Christianity.
Yeah. I think there is a certain element of that. I think how shall I say it? It's a very interesting notion, not that simple, because already in Eretz Yisrael, once you have something like the Mishnah, okay, which is a compilation of laws in Hebrew, relatively accessible, that start to lay down basic principles, supported by a small group of rabbis. Remember, we think that there were thousands and thousands of rabbis running around Eretz Yisrael in 200 CE. That's not the truth, okay? And it took a number of centuries, by the way, for Talmudic and for rabbinic law to be absorbed by the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. Literally, we know that the rabbis in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries even had difficulty getting Jews in the land of Israel to live up to the law to the degree that they would have hoped for. And that's a fact. A friend of mine, Lee Levine, wrote a book about that, and he quotes Talmudic sources left and right to validate that point. So I'm saying is there was an internal need that emerged because the rabbinic system was far more broad sweeping than the biblical system. Okay, details became important. All kinds of things that were operating before on common law, shall we say, or accepted practices, increasingly became defined by legal category. That's what you have when you begin to have a quasi-codification. Now, the Mishnah and the Talmud are by no means codes, but they do start to limit what is acceptable discussion within law. Okay, and ultimately law codes develop, but at the same time Christianity and Islam are developing law codes. So the point is, on the one hand, there was an internal need. And same thing in Babylonia. There are disputes among rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud as to what degree can you incorporate folk practices of the Babylonians. We're talking Persians, right? This is the era of the Persian monarchy, right? We're talking Iraq. The major centers are in Iraq, but it's a Persian empire, right? There are legal discussions in the Talmud whether you can have use this kind of a facility for this kind of a celebration of a Jewish event. And the argument came back, no, but it's too much like the Goyim. You shouldn't do that because even though you're celebrating a Jewish thing, it's taking on the appearance of Goyish culture, okay? And the fact is, Talmud absorbed legal principles from Christian law codes, or that were from Persian law codes, or at least that were expressed within Persian life experiences, being part of the Persian world. It came in. And so given that kind of a pressure, which is hardly Christianity, right? There's Zoroastrians, but as part of that struggle with an external culture, yes, the rabbis pushed back and began to define things in a more narrow way. All right. So that meant there was, yes, indeed, a focus on law, but it wasn't strictly to separate from Christians. There was an element of that, but you've got to understand up until, I would say the 5th century, 4th century, let's hold on, 300s. Right. Remember, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman world with Constantine in the first few decades of the 4th century, right? Then it became the official religion of the Roman world. And it took a few centuries for that also to take hold, right? So all I'm saying is, yes, I would agree that to a certain degree, we did emphasize law, right? Because it wasn't simply to separate us, but it was to clarify for ourselves how we follow the teachings that God put before us. In the process, yes. So this legalism became more dominant because life is based upon real life, legally defined practices, okay? And that's an offshoot. So, to a certain degree, the more theological, there are discussions that the rabbis have is, should you teach ta'amei hamitzvot? When you teach law, should you go along and explain why these things should be done, other than it's the law of God? But should you explain, if you do this, it'll make things more meaningful, more spiritual, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole slew of rabbinic authorities who say, no, you do it because it's the word of God. Don't ask questions. It's the law, right? And that was not to protect you from becoming a Christian. It was the law, okay? But at the same time, you see what it does is it sort of pours cold water on the notion of finding spiritual, what we would call meaning. Today we seek meaning, and one of the things we have to do, when we teach Judaism, is to find out what is the meaning behind this. How can I find meaning in kashrut? How can I find meaning in group prayer in a synagogue, right? How can I find meaning in giving to tzedakah? Now, certain things are universal principles, so they're easier to explain. But the point is, that pushback against finding meaning, as opposed to the discipline of obeying the teachings of the master, right? That had a powerful impact on how we developed. So I would say there is an element of it, I would say yes, but at the same time, I just think that a lot of internal forces that also shaped that. I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but I think you just got to focus, all I'm saying is don't overblow it. There is an element of that. I'm not denying it. We seek to define ourselves in ways that are different, but we often use that. We talk about kashrut does that, Brit Milah does that, right? Shabbos, no work on Shabbos. Those are the three areas that have always been pointed to by Gentiles looking at Jews. That's why they're such a weird people, because they're so different, right? These are things that are part of real life, and we push those things because they were clear identifiers of our relationship with God, okay?
Thank you, Rabbi. That expands it for me. I appreciate that.
Good, okay. I would say, let's say Rachel and then Tybal.
I haven't read the introduction to the book. I have heard several Zoom lectures where Shai Held explains this. And there's two things that I heard from Rabbi Held that I want to introduce to this discussion. First is, over the years of rabbinic Judaism and from the time the Roman Empire adopted Christianity until the modern era, is an awful lot of time for Jews to absorb messages from the larger culture around us. And that some of those messages have been that we're obsessed with legalistic stuff and are not loving in the sense that Christians want to claim ownership of loving, whatever that means. But I am bringing this up because Shai Held says he wrote this book as pushback against the notice or the assumption that Judaism is more legalistic than it is loving.
Wait, Rachel, let me just introduce. You came in a little bit late. We discussed that before you joined us.
Okay.
So, but you're validating. Thank you, because I'm glad you did it, because you just validated what I was saying beforehand. Okay, so I thank you for that. Okay, continue.
There was another idea that Shai Held was promoting in his description of the book that just flew out of my mind. I'll raise my hand again when I think of it.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Okay. Tybal.
I hope fast. When you were answering Marion, I started hearing Rabbi Elliot Dorff in my head, whom I love to hear on my head on one specific point. And if this isn't a correct interpretation, of course, you'll fix it. But I think it's gone beyond Christian specifically in terms of a difference in worldview to what I'm going to call Western. And where I heard Rabbi Dorff in my head is when he explains the difference in worldview. A Western person wakes up and says, what are my rights? What are my privileges? What am I entitled to? A Jew wakes up and says, what do I owe the kahal, the community, the obligation? It's not that one is right or wrong, a balance. But to me, that's part of the difference in why the focus on meaning, because if in centuries, particularly if you were in the smaller places, or even if you were in a city where the government didn't want to touch you and you governed yourself, the internalized worldview wouldn't have as much emphasis on personal meaning. It's like the flip between, Western, remember the president, points of light, all those things. Volunteering is orders of magnitude worth more than obligation, but not from a Jewish worldview. It's the reverse. So I think that's a piece in the part about meaning that for a very long time, the worldview, if you were living in a Jewish community, that isn't as natural a question as it is for a Western educated person,
right?
Regardless of how religious you are.
Yes, I think. Well, look, one of the major pushes of the Enlightenment was the individual rights, right? That was part of the Enlightenment, that the individual has to be respected, and that, in a sense, was a pushback against the church, which spoke about the church being the ultimate focus of how people operate, and the collective, and that they probably got from the Jews ultimately, going back, that the collective, the community, is important. But at the same time, so the Enlightenment, that's why you have the Bill of Rights. That's why you have a constitution with things like that. That's why you have the rights of man. All these different sources are written focusing on the individual. And that had a big impact on how Western culture developed. And today, you have people who are, who focus, like on the individual rights of what that one has, and use that as a means of perhaps arguing against an attempt. It's sort of the notion of the individual, let's say, versus socialism, right? Those are, we would say, are both two different extremes of how the Western world operates. I'm not going to say communism because that's politicized. Don't want to put that in the picture right now. But the notion being socialism means it's the group that ultimately is what counts. Whereas the individualistic approach is no, I as an individual count. And in a certain respect, socialism, in some respects, the control of the values of the community over what an individual can do, that's good Jewish law. I mean, read Jewish economic law. You will find that it is appropriate for the community to impose limits on how much can a person jack up the price on an object that they're selling. Price gouging. It's against the law in Judaism. Okay? Taxation that comes out of what you've earned, part of Jewish law. So that's the community imposing, in a sense, on the rights of the individual. And that's a tension that exists within Judaism. Because Judaism, that's a good example, right? Because Judaism says you are allowed to create your own business. You can own your business and control your funds. But number one, we are going to take from you X percentage for part of your support of our community. We call that taxes. Number two, in addition to that, it is also we're going to put pressure on you as a Jew to give to tzedakah on a personal basis to poor people beyond what the community can do. Number three, we're going to make sure that your so to speak, that your weights and measures are valid. We're going to check that. And if we find it's is an imbalance in some fashion, we're going to fine you. This is all the community controlling the rights of an entrepreneur. Okay, but that's Judaism. Right? But it's a balance. Okay, that's a challenging thing too, by the way. Anyway, so getting back to the point, though, yes, there is an element of validity in what you said, Tybal, that the whole notion of my choice, whether I believe or don't believe, it is something that was thrust, given higher importance, especially with the pushback against the dogmatism of the church. I'm speaking in Western Europe in particular, right? Because it was dogmatic and it was imposing things in ways that the people did not like. And remember what happened to churches throughout Western Europe after, during the period of the French Revolution, thereafter. I mean, even before that in England, you had people burning down Catholic cathedrals and churches because of their rejection of the church, right? And ultimately, what was the message of Protestantism? Who has a right to interpret the Bible? You and I. That was Protestantism. We don't rely on the priests to tell us what the meaning is. Take the Bible, put it in your hand, you read it. What does it mean? What is it? How do you understand this? That's fine. As long as you base it in the text, that's good. Okay? An individual can do it. I used to teach and give sermons from time to time in African American churches. Not all the time, but I had that experience. It is wonderful because all those folks are sitting there with their Bible, right? They got their Bible and they're going to hold it right there and say, amen, Rabbi, you said it, And I once quoted the wrong verse because I hadn't opened to the page quickly enough. I said, chapter 16, Isaiah 16:27. And they looked at this, no, Rabbi, that's verse 26, because they had it there, because they were following me because it was their obligation to God to read that book and to learn it and know it and value it and talk about it and feel about it. So, that's great. But again, it empowers the individual. And that was in opposition to the church, where the priests told you what to read. They didn't have Bibles in the Catholic churches, even after they printed things. They didn't open up their Bibles. They listened to what the priest was saying. That's how they got their godliness. The Protestants said, no, man, you got to look at the book. Okay, so yes, so culturally that is a valid point. And as often is the case, I agree with my friend and beloved friend, Elliot Dorff. Thank you. Okay, Cheryl. Didn't know Denise and then Cheryl. Sorry. Cheryl first. Cheryl.
First of all, thank you very much for letting me join you because it's quite late in England and it's been worth every minute so far. Secondly, this is going to be a very anglicised way of looking at things, but yes, the original Christian church took this view that Christianity is about love and Judaism is about law. But looking at English church history and indeed European church history, it seems to me that it, in some ways, is far more legalistic than Judaism. Judaism has got 613 commandments. Okay, we know that. It always did. But it doesn't say to people it's better to marry than to burn. It doesn't suggest that you can only be a good person by removing yourself from any kind of worldly joy. It doesn't suggest that rabbis shouldn't get married. And it seems to me that what might have been true initially is no longer the case. Looking at, as you said, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the things that were done by Protestants to Catholics and vice versa are just hideous.
Of course. Right. Yes, that's absolutely true. There's no question. As I was saying, they burned down churches indiscriminately. Yes, there's no question about it. I think, yeah, that's a good observation. But I don't know if the Protestants absorbed the concept of the Jews as being a faith that was based on love. I think you're right that there is extremism. What you're talking about is the fact that ostensibly the rights of the recognition of the sanctity of the individual was an element of the foundation of Protestantism. At the same time, there's no question that I don't think that they absorbed that same kind of respect for the individual Jew, because the anti-Jewish sentiment. Remember, both the British Church and the German Church, which were Protestants, ultimately carried with them elements of Catholicism in terms of certain elements of their worldview. And I don't think these people fell in love with the Jews any more than the Catholics did, to be very honest. And I'm sure if you looked and found, I know Martin Luther, you know what happened with him, okay? I mean, granted, he's not Anglican, he's Lutheran. But, oh boy, when what he believed was that if you break from the church, the Jews would come flocking to Jesus, all right? And we didn't. And he got very angry at us. And then he came out with a book called On the Jews and Their Lives.
Yes.
Okay? So that is part of the Reformation. Okay? And I don't know, I haven't followed the attitudes of the British church towards the Jews throughout history, once they broke away. But I do know that the Jews, the good thing is that at a certain point, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, ultimately, through various means, Jews could come back into England. But up until that time, and remember that the Reformation in England was already under the way with Queen Elizabeth, right? You go back to the 16th century. So there were a couple centuries there where that did not encourage them to open the doors to the Jews. They were no different from the Catholics on that point. So, you've got this notion then of, yes, the Protestants did horrible things, and you think that was not very Christian of them, right? What they did. Where was their love, right? And of course, we understand that, look, but to be very honest with you, there are people in the Jewish world today who look down who really look at the Christian world, and when they use the word goyim, it's not with love. Oh, let's be honest, okay? We have our share of them too. Fortunately, they don't have that much power, although I'm not sure what's happening in Israel in that regard right now. It's quite disturbing to see some of the extremes in Judaism that are being expressed right now. But we haven't had the power to do anything about it. So the notion of us persecuting non-Jews there's no long history about that. Unless you want to go back to the Maccabees. Okay. Well, we did some stuff then. Yeah, we absolutely did. When you have power, you use it. But after that, as you said, you were right in saying there was, a long, long time that I think this is what Rabbi Held mentioned that Rachel told us. You were talking millennia that these attitudes toward the Jews and of the Jews experiencing as a minority the impact of a majority population, we're talking about many, many centuries, and it does have an impact on both sides. There's no question about it. Absolutely. But at the same time, unfortunately, religion, one of the weaknesses of religion, and I hate to say this, but the biblically based religions, including Islam, have within them some very, very negative attitudes towards the unbeliever, toward the outsider. You can find them in all of our traditions. And that's, read the book of Deuteronomy. You're going to find the foundation of it in that book. That book was written by religious extremists who were pushing paganism out of Jewish religious practice because it had been around until around the year 600, active in Emeritus Israel. There's no question about it, and even a little bit after that. So the point is, it was an extreme push. And, on the one hand, you say, wow, look what they did. They really cleaned out the mess, didn't they? Whoopee-doo. Okay, but they did a lot of bad stuff. We would say, wow, that's not very good. Anyhow, So, I mean, that's a problem with organized religion. If it has great power, it can use that power to promote its organization because they believe we're doing the will of God. I mean, what's Hamas about? People don't realize it. And I don't want to get political, but it is a fact. Hamas is based on religion. Hamas is based on an extremist form of Islam that ultimately looks to taking over the whole world, right? It's an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. Read their texts. You'll see what I'm talking about. That's written black on white. It's not just me. Okay, and that's what's happening right now in those who are running the Mr. Sinwar is a firm believer in that. Absolutely. And so it's active right now in that respect. So, it's a problem with religion. It's a problem with, now you see it in India. Indians are supposed to be very tolerant because there are multiple faith traditions. But from what I understand, what they're trying to do, what the government has been trying to do with the Muslims has been to really put them down. Well, that's not being tolerant. So religion, that's the downside. If you're speaking the word of God and the other guy's speaking the word of the devil, then you want to clean out the devil. I'm being very, simplistic, I know. Okay. All right, but thank you, Cheryl. No, that's a good observation, and you're right. The fact that you are separating yourself from the challenges of the Catholic Church doesn't mean that you necessarily are fully giving up the behavior that you didn't like in them. You may still be using it. Yes. Okay. Denise.
So going back to what you were saying earlier, listing various laws about weights and measures and overcharging and all these things. But I think you can extrapolate it to lots and lots of things. I think the laws in many ways can be seen as expressions of love. Because if you look at love, it's not just a feeling, it's an action, it's a verb. And you have to manifest it. And so overcharging people is not a loving thing to do.
Right.
And, even if you look at the laws of kashrus, where it's like, if you just kill something in a painful way, that's not loving. And then even with the chokim, like things like, milk and meat or shatnez or things that just seem totally random, I think there's an element of love there too, in the sense that if you're going to carry on a healthy, loving relationship over time, you're going to end up doing random things for that person that don't make any sense to you, or accepting things about their personalities that you think are just kind of quirky and weird and nuts. But if they don't hurt you and they don't do anything unhealthy to your life, you just kind of go with it. And that's a valuable skill to cultivate.
Yes.
And we can practice with that through the different mitzvot. So I think that you can make a really strong case that all of those laws and things are actually part of love.
I agree. And I think that Rabbi Held would agree. And the notion, for example, of let's talk about controlling interest rates, right? There's a love factor in there, which is to protect the borrower who is in need from being taken advantage of. And you're showing love. The community there is showing love that the lender was not showing. And hopefully teaching the lesson to the lender, be reasonable. If you were reasonable in the interest you were charging, we wouldn't have to make laws like this. But ultimately, the loan is, of course, you're entitled to earn money off of your money. But at the same time, let's put a limit on it, because the poor person you're lending the money to, you're just squeezing them more. There's no love in that. You're absolutely right. And that's the point that Held makes. So good. Amen. Barbara. Never mind. Okay, I see it. Thank you. All right. You got to go. Okay. Talk to you whenever. Next week. Yes. All right. Okay. Anybody else? Now I want to find, what did you find troubling in the book? I see Bert is a man of his word.
I'm not going to say troubling, but I will say confusing. By the time I got through the introduction, are we just talking about the introduction or also the first chapter?
Both.
Okay. By the time I got through with them, it sounded to me, on the one hand, like a lot of word soup. And that it's if I had a penny for every time he used the word love, this love, God loves, I love, you love, and never bothered to say how he was using the word and what the word love meant. And so I was having a lot of trouble understanding I mean, I kind of understand on the one hand, but I'm not a big fan of the anthropomorphic view of God. And so God loves me was hard for me to understand what he was talking about. So that was a problem that I had. Here's a book about love in Judaism, and he never bothers to talk about what love, how he's using the word love. Then I heard this interview, and I forget who, it's an hour long, with Rabbi Held and Congressman Jamie Raskin, of all people, which I didn't understand why he was there. And Rabbi Held really explained what he was talking about in terms of love, that he was not talking about love as an emotion, but as an orientation, as an attitude, as a perspective, which can include the emotion of love, but that's not how he was using it. So I guess the bad thing was I didn't understand it from the book. But the good thing is when I understand that, then it took on a whole other dimension. And it's like what you were talking about before when you said, controlling interest rates, that's an expression of love, right? And God loves us, God loves me is not like a person loves another person, but it's more in terms of an orientation of kindness, and you can add a lot of other adjectives there, than it is the emotion like of what I have for my wife,
Right.
or my children.
Right, exactly. And I think you're correct, but I think what you need to do is wait till you finish the book.
I'm fine now. I'm fine now.
My point is, because what I think is going to happen is he will eventually go through different phases, different facets of how he sees this. And in the end, I haven't read the conclusion. Maybe we should all jump ahead and read it, and see where he ends up. It may make it easier, but I think we just need to be patient. Okay. But I think even here in what we've read, it's clear that he's talking about action, right? I mean, there is a discussion among Bible scholars as to what does it mean to be created in the image of God based upon the Torah itself, right? So is that a statement about various attributes of God, or is that a statement about action? Okay. All right. I think it happens to be both, because I don't think that the priestly traditions or whatever the traditions we're talking about back then were as concerned with anthropomorphism as they became later. Okay, if you read the five books of Moses, it's clear Deuteronomy is the least anthropomorphic. The other books have got a lot of anthropomorphism. In other words, talking about God in human terms. Okay, remember my friend, Benjamin Summer wrote a book called The Bodies of God, based upon the five books of Moses. All right, I won't go into that. That's a different subject right now. But the point is, the dealing with the anthropomorphic elements of God that were part of paganism, it took many centuries for that to be filtered down. But then you had Kabbalah, the Zohar comes back, and lo and behold, you're dealing with it again. Right? You're talking about attributes that almost become, if you read the Zohar, become personified. So, I mean, that's why Rembaum hated it. He didn't know the Zohar, but he knew the beginnings of medieval mysticism, okay? And my God, read the mystics in the Talmudic period. You want to know how big God is? Open up the Shiur Komad. They will tell you exactly how big God is. His legs are 20 million parsangs long. Right? His arm is 10 million parsangs long. Literally, all right? Wow. But he was light. It wasn't a physical body. It was a body of light. Okay, that's the difference. But the point is, they're using clearly pagan terms, right? Anyway, point is though that I think So the other angle on what it means to be in the image of God is the notion of acting in a certain way, and that's true, because what does it mean if you read Genesis chapter 1? And ultimately how the biblical law carries it out, right? God says you have to rule. That's action, right? You are empowered to rule. And then what does it say right after that in verses 29 and 30 of chapter 1? It says, number 1, I'm giving you agriculture. You live off of agriculture. That is to say, the grains of wheat and the fruits of trees. That's very, very clear. That's for you. The rest of the creatures who eat, I give what? Green grass. And this comes after ruling. So what's the implication here? you have to rule in a manner that allows humans to have their food to eat, but also that doesn't impair the ability of the rest of the creatures to eat, right? Balance. That's what it means. Action, okay? And you have to reproduce. Puravu. That's part of the mandate that he gives, because he needs humans, according to chapter 1, who are now his lieutenants in the world, to manage it properly, because he's sort of pulling back. That's chapter 1, right? But the point is, it's imposing what Held says, a responsibility to act in a godly way. So in a sense, Kedoshim, which you mentioned from the beginning, is an expression of what it means to be in God's image, acting in a certain way. So yes, there is grounds for that as well. All right, but I would say just be patient with the book. We can come back to talking about this when we finish reading it. Okay. All right. Barbara Brieger.
My patient was very nice. I told her what I was doing, and she said, "Oh, I'll go make phone calls. You go back to your class." I think I've told you this before, that your classmate David's father, Saul, gave a sermon on Yom Kippur about 65 years ago about the difference between belief and faith. And his statement was very compelling to me at the time, and still is, that a scientist and as a physician, we're interested in science, doesn't necessarily believe that something you can't see is really true, but you can have faith that it's true. And that really made a difference to me in my life. And that takes me to the point of the word love. Ahava both means like and love. And somehow I feel like, as with the fact that I have a faith that there's probably some kind of supreme being, that I think that liking it is closer to what I feel than love for everything. I think it's more powerful that you like everything than just to say you love everything. Because I think love to me is something for like your parents, your kids, your relatives. I don't know that I can say that I love every single person in the world and can deal with them as if I love them. So I kind of prefer the word like. That's my statement.
No, I think that's interesting. He deals with that in a certain respect, because he will say that obviously, look, there's going to be a whole there is already a discussion. One second. In the first chapter already, he talks about these kinds of things, or it translates out into action. And the point is that it's in the introduction. The whole notion of being for yourself and what it means in terms of relating to the other. And I think this is sort of where Bert was taking us. It means the definition of love that he uses is broader than what you're feeling. But he will recognize, though, that the love that you share with your family, let's say, is different from the love that you would share with another person. Because if love is defined by how you act, if you act respectfully to another person, right, and if that person is in trouble and they need help, and you help them, and you encourage them, even though you may not even know them. For all you know, they could be a crook, but there they are in need, and you help them. Okay, you're expressing love, because it is a recognition of their personhood, of their being a creature of God, and being therefore, entitled to your expression of love. So I think he would say there are different kinds of love. And that goes back to what Bert said, that his concept of love is not specifically the emotional thing. It doesn't discount the emotion. Your feelings for your family are deep. There is deep emotion there, as there should be. When you lose a member of your family, it's profoundly painful. When you lose a friend, it could be painful. There's no question if you're very close. But there's a difference between that and losing let's say, a parent. A friend is close, but at the and I know I know people who lost a parent, and they didn't mourn very much because they had the relationship with the parent was very bad. Okay, and that happens. I would say that is the exception, okay? But the point, nonetheless, one can accept the fact that you're going to grieve over a loss of a child. That's the worst thing. Worst thing, okay? Nothing, and that's because that's your child. The love that you have for that child is probably the deepest love you could ever have, even though eventually, that child will become their own person. But at those early years, gosh, that dependence, even though the child is an independent entity, but the level of dependence and, my goodness, and then to lose it all, boom, right? So sure, it's different. It's different how you love a spouse. How you love a spouse is different. You can get big arguments with your spouse, but you'll love them because it's bigger than the argument. And you know that you can sit down and work it out. That's what your love does. But that's different from loving a person by caring for them, even if you don't know them. So if you volunteer at a food bank and you help a person, give them the food and sit with them and make them feel like a human being, you are expressing love. I would say, yes, you're right. The emotions are different, but at the same time, the ultimate value of finding infinite meaning and worth in another creature, and this can go beyond human beings in a sense, okay? I mean, I don't know if you can love a redwood tree. I would have difficulty loving a redwood tree, but I must say I was pained when I learned that the redwood forests that exist now in Northern California and Southern Oregon, what you see is only 10% of what used to be there. And these trees are magnificent creatures. And you see the power of God in not that you worship the tree, but the fact of how those trees operate. It's a miracle. And for what human beings did coming in and just randomly cutting them because they used it for wood, for homes, okay, and furniture and whatever. Redwood, if you used to get a redwood cabinet, my God, that was amazing, right? But how many, loss of trees? Because I don't feel the same. I don't feel an emotion of love for a tree that I do for a human being. But standing in awe of those trees, it's a sense of I love the tree in the sense that it is an expression of an amazing power within nature, and that's an expression of God. So there's a godly element in the power of that tree. And I'm not worshiping the tree as God. It's a product of God's love, and I share that. So, I mean, as you see, you can interpret in different ways. And I think you'll see the book, that'll come clear as you move through the different parts of the book. And we're going to find things in the book that we're not happy with. That's fine. Okay. And we'll talk about that. So I'm not trying to argue that the book is the be all and end all. So in answering all questions about what is love, right? I remember there was an old rock song. What is love? 5 foot of something with a ponytail.
5 foot of heaven in a ponytail.
That's it. Right. That's what is love? 5 foot of heaven in a ponytail. My God.
For those of us who grew up in the 50s.
Yes. How can anybody today even think about that? Sheesh. Okay. Anyway, moving on. Okay. But yes. Okay, Barbara. Thank you. That's a valid point. And I think we understand maybe what I think our author's talking about. Bobby Meth.
From what you described as the motivation of Rabbi Held, it sounds like it's the same motivation that Rabbi Volpe had when he wrote his first book, Healer of Shattered Hearts, A Jewish View of God.
Yes.
So how is this book different? It's obviously longer. Is it more academic? How is it different than what Rabbi Volpe wrote in his first book?
It's broader than that because he's not only talking about loving of God through the perspective of God, but a lot about interpersonal relations.
It's pretty academic, too.
Huh?
I thought it was pretty academic.
Oh, no, it is. I mean, yes, there's no question. I mean, you look at it, you'll see, Bobby, that his citation of sources is unbelievable. I mean, he's citing rabbis and scholars that I never heard of. I mean, Jewish scholars, etc. Plus, as he tells you right up front, he's studied a lot of Christian stuff on this. Christian material that, obviously helped them understand their perspectives, but also modern Christian thinkers who are more open and understanding of what Judaism is about. And he says that they have insights you look at the footnotes, and sometimes he'll mention their names in the text. You will have insights that they have that really are very much applicable and fit in within the, shall we say, the four cubits, the Dalet Amot of Jewish tradition and thinking. And he learned a lot he found things within Judaism that in many ways are expressed very nicely by non-Jewish theologians and thinkers when they talk about love as well. So, yes.
So it's responding to the same motivation, but perhaps from a more academic perspective?
Broader, much broader. Yes. I mean, okay. He was trying specifically, to deal with certain responses that we have to evil, where's God, and stuff like that, more focusing on how to understand how God operates in that respect. But there is an element of that in the book, to be sure. But I think he's also spending a lot of time on how we're supposed to behave as well, and the if you will, the ethical implications of what it means to love, translating it into action. Much more on that. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Tybal.
Just for Bobby, since you haven't read it, the way Rabbi Rembaum started out in saying the repeated anecdote that he asked Jews where that verse was found, and most Jews think, in his experience, it's in the New Testament. In the beginning of the book, Shai talks about teaching at JTS and rabbinical students who were not first-year students totally missing the place that love has in the foundations of Judaism. So that's the motivation, or a big part of the motivation.
Right. All right. I want to conclude. We have another 8 minutes. If you have a Siddur handy, as I hoped you would, if not, if you can grab one quickly, I would like you to open up to the morning service, the Shacharit service, whether it is for weekday or Shabbat, and find the section that's called the Shema and its blessing. Okay? It's after the Psalms, before the Amidah, where the Baruch Hu is, and the blessings that flow thereafter.
We're starting with Ahava?
Well, no, we're starting with the Or, Yotzer Or, creator.
Oh, Yotzer Or, okay.
Yeah. And this is in the weekday version. The Shabbat version is more embellished. It begins with the Baruch Hu in the morning, right? And then you have the Yotzer blessing, the first blessing preceding the Shema, which is a very long blessing because it continues on and on a few pages, okay? But the paragraph after the Baruch Hu is Hameir La'aretz. And what does it say? What did God use when he created the world? What's the first?
Rachamim.
Right up front. The first act that God did, creation, was an act of compassion. Now, Held spends a lot of time talking about compassion as an element of love or an expression of love, and he's absolutely right. But you see, it's not power, right? This is not power. This is love, right? And it's right there, the first thing. So, I mean, that's something that a lot of people say all the time, but don't stop to think of what it means in terms of what's the message here, okay? And now you understand why Rashi, in his commenting on why it is that in the second chapter of Genesis, God is not called Elohim, but Adonai Elohim, because Adonai, Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, the four-letter name of God, is ultimately an expression of God's compassion. And compassion had to be melded into a blend with justice in order that the world could exist. But then Rashi says, and God gave precedence to his private name, Adonai, meaning what came first? What was number one on the list? Compassion or law? Compassion was first. And that's Rashi. Brilliant, okay? And that four-letter name of God came over time to be associated with God's compassion. And that's why it says, Baruch atah Adonai, Adonai Eloheinu.
Adonai, twice. Adonai, compassion sandwich.
What?
It's a compassion sandwich.
Yeah.
Adonai Eloheinu Adonai.
Oh, no, that's Shema Yisrael. I'm talking Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, right? So Adonai comes before God, Elohim as king. King rules. Adonai loves. God has both. But look what comes first. And that's basic Jewish ritual. I mean, how can you not be impressed by that unless you just don't take it seriously? So read the prayers a little bit more carefully, my friends. And then now, okay, so that point has been established. Move on now. You finish the Yotzer blessing, and you look at Ahava Rabbah. Move on to, with great love you have loved us. The blessing immediately before the Shema. Okay, find that, please. Okay, so Ahava Rabbah Ahavtanu. With great love have you loved us. Adonai Eloheinu. Chemla gedola v'teiracham alta aleinu. Chemla, loving, compassion, care, you have shared with us. Okay? So hold on a second. Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu. All right? I will be non-gender. Our parent, our king. Okay? What comes first? Parent.
Parent.
Avinu Malkeinu. Chanenu. Have compassion on us. Vaneh, and answer us, right? Abba, Ima, comes before Melech. What's the difference? A king rules to establish rules because he's got to control a kingdom, right? But a parent, love. Love, in the end, unbounded love. That's the parent. And look what comes first. You never find, I want you to find, you can open up any book, go online, look at any kinds of concordances, and find Malkeinu Avinu. If you can find me where it says Malkeinu Avinu, I will give you a gold star. And of course, with that gold star, it's your key to the world to come. Whatever. Okay? If you can find that, all right? Okay. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu, now listen to this. Avinu, Ha'av, Harachaman, Hamrachem, Rachem. Our Father, the compassionate one, who has compassion, have compassion. 5 words in a row that focus on what? Rachamim. In the context of love, subcategory of love. And finally, the end, Baruch HaBocher B'Yemo Yisrael B'Ahava, who chooses Israel with love. But before that, it says, we are to proclaim your oneness out of love. We have to respond back to God by proclaiming God's oneness out of love. And then what do? We say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokecha. We proclaim God's unity. And then it tells us, Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. Now you got to do what it said up above that you said you're going to do, which is love God back. So God loves us, wants us to proclaim that. We say we will proclaim it. We proclaim it. Now we got to do is act on that, which is by loving God back. And how do we love God back? By acting in a godly way and loving God. Okay? That's what you call a covenant. It's a brit. I do for you, you do for me. And we agree. It's a covenant of love. Right there in the center of our Siddur. How can you miss it? Well, if you don't read it carefully, you miss it. Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
So if right before in the Shema it says Hashem is one, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, right? And then it says Hafta, Hashem Elokecha, is kind of telling us to love the oneness, to love everything, not just God up there, but everywhere, like the whole universe.
Well, when
we just finished saying that Hashem Elokeinu, those words is Echad. So then, if right after that it says you should love Hashem Elokecha, then you should love the oneness, no?
Yeah, well, yeah, the oneness, but it means, yes, of course, God, and by extension, all of God's creations. In other words, if I'm understanding you, the totality of how God operates, which means the world that God created in which we live. Sure, you're supposed to. That's why we say today, much more so in the last centuries than earlier, shchita, when you kill an animal to eat it, right? The laws that govern how the shochet operates are intended to make sure what? That the cut is clean and painless, or as painless as it can be. And the fact is, it probably is. It's more like when you cut your finger with a razor. When you cut a finger with a razor, you don't feel that except after a few seconds, because it takes that time for that activity to hit the brain and come back. All right, it's the same thing when you shech the cow, right? By the time they are beginning to feel the pain, they're unconscious because the blood is flowing out of the brain. I hate to get so detailed on it, but the fact is, and that's why the shochet's knife can have no niches, no cuts, what's the term I'm looking for? It's unevenness in the. It's got to be like
nicks. Is the term nicks? Nicks in nicks.
Oh, that's right. No nicks in the blade. If it's a nick in the blade, then the animal, it's a wasted animal, and the shochet probably loses his job. That's the way it should be. Okay? All right, so that's the point. Yes, because tsar balei chayim, causing pain to any living thing, that's not the will of God. It's an aveirah. It's a sin. You shouldn't do it. And if you shouldn't do it to any living being, you shouldn't do it to people either. So yes, when you say you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, right? With everything, in the totality of how you operate. Sure, that's exactly right. So there it is, folks, right in the middle of the Siddur, the centrality of love. All right. So I say to you all, this is great. I mean, I don't know how you felt. I have learned such a great deal from I always do, because I guess I'm lucky. I get very smart people who enroll for the classes, and therefore you push me and shove me around, and that's great. And I learn, and you learn, and we learn from each other. So this whole course rises and falls on your participation. And today you all get an A. So I'm very proud of you. I'm happy to give you an A, and you all get a gold star.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.